Here we are talking about the roaring 20s come to a crash or the rise and fall of the 20s. So in this discussion, we're not going to talk so much about the rise of the 20s. I think that's outlined very clearly in the book, but we're going to talk about what led to the fall and the great crash and what led the country into the Great Depression. So the stock market played a very important role. So before we talk about what role it played, let's first talk specifically about what stock is. So a stock is a specific ownership in a company. And so Apple, for example, shown here, can sell stocks in the company, and this stock grants individuals ownership in that company. Now, the reason why a company would sell stocks is to raise money to achieve some of their company objectives. And so when we think about Apple, so Apple right now is, as of this morning, was $119.94 per share. So you could buy one stock for $120. If you were to add up all the stock that Apple has, the number of stocks and multiply it by the price, that would be their market cap. So Apple is worth over $2 trillion. So this is how stocks are done. Now, what does a stock represent? A stock represents the value of a company. So if Apple becomes more profitable, they have a new phone that comes out that has really high sales, that's going to drive up the price of the stock because it increases the value of the company. And so that's the general idea of a stock, is a stock's price represents the value of a company. A company that is increasing in value, the stock goes up. A company that is decreasing in value, the stock would go down. And so we talk about the 1920s, and what we see is that the stock market becomes a big boom. So the S&P 500 is the 500 largest companies listed on the stock exchange. And it's an index telling if you bought one stock in each of these companies, how much would that be worth? And so they normalize it to say, okay, let's just call this 100. What happens to that index, that value over time? What you see is through the 1920s, it more than triples. And so in a 9-year period, there's a 300% return on one's investment. That's very big. And so this is where, again, it's the value of stocks is people really want to buy stocks this time period because there's such a high return. And this led to speculation. So here's a scenario. So you could borrow money to buy a stock. So if you could take out a loan for 50% interest and you could buy a stock with a 5% return, should you borrow $100,000 and invest in the stock market? And the answer is no, because the return of the stock is less than the interest on the loan. And so this wouldn't make sense. But that wasn't the case in the 1920s. The 1920s looked more like scenario B, is you could take out a loan and pay 5%. You could then invest that money from the loan into the stock market and get a return of 50%. In that case, it would make sense to borrow that money. And so this is where many individuals began to purchase stock on speculation. They would borrow money to buy the stock. And this works until the stock prices don't rise as much, or the rate of return on stocks is equal to or less than the interest rates on the loan. And so that's just one of the challenges when we think about the stock market, is a lot of the stocks were purchased and the driving the stock market was being driven by speculation purchases. So when we think about here is the stock market crash was one of the 5 explanations. We'll talk about each of these in turn. Because of speculation, individuals were purchasing stock prices on speculation. What happens when the stock price doesn't rise as much? Well, when that happens, what you see is that individuals start to sell their stock, try to sell it so they can pay back their loan as quickly as possible. And as many more people start to sell, it actually causes a panic to people start selling it. And so this is what we see is that's one of the driving factors that happened. We have Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, where the stock market within a day begins to crash. And over the next year, we see a dramatic decline in the stock market that within 2 years, it goes back to where it was 10 years before. So a very large crash in that stock market that contributes to the crash and eventually the Great Depression, because this is individuals who borrow money to invest, and so when the stock market crashes, they don't have the ability to pay back those loans that they made to purchase. And that leads us to the second issue, bank failures. Banks were failing at this time, which caused further economic hardship. So we talk about a bank. A bank has several purposes. One of the main purposes of a bank is to connect people who want to save money. So you can take your money to a bank, you can put it in the vault there, and you can save it and come back and get it another time when you need it. And the bank might even pay you interest to save money within the bank. They then take that money in the bank and they don't keep it in the vault. is they then loan that out to individuals who have ideas for a new business, who want to buy a car, who want to buy a home. And they do these because the bank, by giving out that money, is they are being assured that they're going to get a steady stream of income for the next 30 years if it's a home, 5 years if it's a car. And so the bank's going to lend out that money. And so the purpose of a bank, excuse me, is to connect those that want to save with those that want to borrow. It's a credit institution. It provides credit to those people who want to borrow to increase their businesses or to start businesses or to buy a home. And so this is really helpful. And so when you give out a loan, the bank is purchasing a steady stream of payments. And so the bank then can pay interest to the person who's lending the bank some money. And this works really well as long as those people who borrowed the money pay back. But the moment that they are not able to pay back, it can create a very big challenge. And so when they can't pay back, what happens is now the bank has lent out other people's money and they're not getting those payments. And so people might come to the bank and ask to withdraw their savings, and there's no money in the bank to do so. And so this is what leads to bank failures, is banks lose money from the loans they make. And then people try to withdraw their money from the bank, and the bank doesn't have that money, so they go out of business. And people who saved money lose all their savings. The bank would then be able to sell off these loans, so other banks might purchase this and try to then use collection services to collect the money from those other loans. And so this is what we call a bank failure. And these can be very challenging. And there's many bank failures this time period, which led to bigger issues, because if there's bank failures, there's not opportunities for new businesses to borrow money. And so because of these bank runs, millions of people lost their money, and 9 million savings accounts were lost. Businesses lost money, just a general loss of money overall. And the issue is when their banks go out of business, there's not a place to go to borrow money. Let's suppose you have a great business idea that could hire a lot of workers and build your new factory, but you can't borrow money, therefore those don't happen. So as banks fail, as there's credit constraints, the economy suffers as a result. The third is reduction in purchases. When your unemployment is uncertain, what do you do? When your income decreases, what do you do? When future economic conditions are uncertain and bleak, what do you do? In all these cases, individuals save more than they consume. And so they begin to save. As a result, fewer purchases are being made, and businesses that are already struggling further struggle because they can't sell the products they're trying to sell. The fourth reason is trouble on the farm. In addition to these, the Midwest hits a tremendous drought. The Dust Bowl. Farmers aren't able to respond, and so the entire Midwest and all these farmers now lose their farms. Banks that have lent them money lose that income. Banks go out of business, and people begin to exodus from the Midwest. The Grapes of Wrath is a book that depicts this as the Joad family looks for a new life out of Oklahoma. And the fifth reason is monetary policy, is the role of the government at this time to increase monetary policy wasn't quite there. And so we talk about monetary policy. By increasing the money supply, that's this big M, it decreases the interest rates. When interest rates are lower, it allows companies to invest more money, which is the big I, and by investing more money, it increases the country's GDP. And so that's what we call expansionary monetary policy. The government can increase the money supply by printing money or by buying bonds to stimulate the economy. And contractionary policy is the opposite. During this time period, the government did not adopt expansionary policy, and we'll see during the Great Depression they actually adopted contractionary policy, which further exacerbated the issue. About what led to the Great Depression, these were the 5 things that impacted it. What we'll talk about in the next chapter is what worked and what didn't work.